Good. Well, thanks everybody for showing up. Again, my name is Lynn Gardner, and I'm very pleased that you can hear me today after Monday's presentation. I was a high school teacher for over 20 years, and I have to say I've never had an experience like that before. So this is it's very new to me to try to operate in this virtual world. I can only imagine what's happening with our folks who are in classrooms right now. So this is the second presentation for the pre-application conference, and hopefully it will kind of wrap into some of the things that you may have questions on, and then also give you some more things to think about as you're beginning to write up for this particular grant. So I am going to go over the grant funding, just give you some historical background to the plan, which is called Section 48, or what we're also kind of rebranding as Diversifying Oregon's Teacher Pathways in Oregon. And then I want to talk a little bit about GYOs, kind of how we're defining them, and then show you some teacher-student demographics and why this particular initiative is part of the Section 48 funding. And then go over the application criteria, which again is around partnerships and operationalizing the state's equity initiatives. I will go over the application and the evaluation criteria, which we didn't do, but that's because I'm more familiar with this than Angela. And then the grant timeline. We do have a new due date for applications just based on some of the needs for people experiencing some of the wildfire devastation. So just giving a little bit of an extension, but I'll talk about why we can't give more than that. And then some funding considerations. We have a document prepared with the answers to your questions, some contact information, and then we'll also have some sources for you. So if you're new to GYOs or you want more information about how we're defining GYOs, we'll provide that for you at the end. So just a little background in case people don't know who we are. The Educator Advancement Council is relatively new. It was created with the passing of Senate Bill 182 back in 2017 with recommendations from the Governor's Council on Educator Advancement. And the EAC is really committed to creating innovative partnerships that are aimed to support Oregon achieving high quality, well-supported and culturally responsive public educators in every classroom. And through 4 key areas, the EAC is committed to create the conditions that center educators' voices. And one of those is by supporting localized equity efforts through the 10 regional educator networks, also called the RENs. The implementation of Section 48, which is the plan that we'll talk about in a minute to diversify Oregon's pathways in education. We also do this in collaboration with many folks. We know we can't just be one entity, and we're actually a very small staff, by the way, so we need the collaboration. So we're aligned with multiple state and local agencies as well as nonprofit and community-based organizations. And then we're also created to be in alignment with the Educator Equity Act. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about that because we haven't really shared that that much from the last one. So before going into this particular grant, I wanted to, and the initiatives under Section 48, which is the plan that is, basically going to provide opportunities to support diversifying Oregon's educators. We want to highlight some of the goals for the Educators Equity Act, which is in relation and alignment with the educator, with everything that EAC is doing. And the Educators Equity Act was formerly called the Minority Teacher Act, which was in 1991. And so this particular act is kind of geared towards, I'll just kind of highlight some of those pieces on there. The commitment to equality for the diverse peoples of this state, and that includes the percentage of diverse educators employed by a school district and or an education service district that reflects the percentage of diverse students in public schools of this state, or the percentage of diverse students in the district. And the Department of Education is also using some federal reports on educator equity to monitor how are we retaining educators of color, how are we recruiting educators of color, And so that's kind of the goal with this particular act and this funding. So Section 48, many of you have already seen this slide. I just kind of want to tell you a little bit about where the funding comes from. This is grant funding, and there's 3 tiered components to it: dismantling barriers, refining and supporting current initiatives, and systemic professional development. Some of the changes we had to make to Tier 3 due to COVID, particularly thinking about how can we be more supportive to our communities of color, as well as the national movement for racial justice in the country right now. So these 3 tiers form the foundation of the plan, which is, again, Section 48. But we do a lot of work with this. So even though the GYOs is one portion of it, under Tier 1, the Oregon Teacher Scholar Program, and the Oregon Administrator Scholar Program, which is new to support administrators of color, is getting in the works right now in partnership with TSPC, as well as teacher licensure and assessment costs. So what we're offering with that is support to educators in the state right now who may need to have some support for helping their licensure or even assessment costs. And then we're also investing in looking at alternatives to teacher assessment, so thinking a little bit differently outside of EdTPA. In Tier 2, that's where we have the GYOs, but I'll talk more about that, of course, later. But we are also funding some courses, online courses for educators around anti-racism. So that will be offered and launched very soon, as well as offering funding for the 6 public universities for them to implement their equity plans. And then the last tier is changed a little bit just due to some of the conditions right now, but it is to support educators of color through Racial Justice Institute, as well as fellowship opportunities for educators of color. And while we don't really have time to go into all of those today, if you are interested, my contact information will be at the end of the slide, so you can reach out if you have any questions about those. So I want to turn and show you some data regarding student-teacher demographics in Oregon that's going to be released soon in the Oregon Educator Equity Report. And it correlates to what the Educator Equity Act, the goal was. And you can kind of get a sense of the gap that we're talking about when we're looking at educators and students of color and what's going on with that view. And since 1997, Oregon has collected data to better understand this gap between the number of students of color and the number of teachers of color. The goal, of course, for this data began after the passage of the Minority Teacher Act. And again, the goal for that act was that it would, by 2001, the number of minority teachers, including administrators employed by school districts and education service districts, shall be approximately proportionate to the number of minority children enrolled in the public schools of the state. So if we're thinking about the goal of that act, we can kind of get a sense that that goal has yet to be met. But there are efforts to work towards closing this gap. Some of you were involved in our first and only GYO work group meeting that was back in March, right before the governor issued the Stay Home, Stay Safe executive order. And over 50 people met to talk about some of the barriers that they believed impacted pathways for youth and adults of color coming into the educator workforce. Some of the themes that emerged included access, or the entry points into the field of education, beginning with the experiences of students themselves in schools and the education spaces. Another theme was recruitment. How are we recruiting students of color into 4-year college degrees in education, as well as educator prep programs, and how are they being retained? That's another point to kind of think about. And they also identified, the participants of the work group identified that there are a number of deficit narratives that are working against recruiting and retaining racially, ethnically, and or linguistically diverse candidates in these programs. And finally, many of them also identified retention once we have teachers in classrooms and in schools as a major barrier to diversifying the educator workforce. And some of the recent data that we have from ODE indicates that there's at least 20% of teachers of color are leaving the field after the first year of teaching. And there's a number of reasons for this. But the main point of that is that there's a loss that's happening, and that's one of the reasons for why this funding is existing, and what are some of the initiatives that the Diversifying Oregon Pathways in Education is trying to address. So when we're thinking about this, I just wanted to highlight this map again. Many people were kind of interested in this on Monday, and I think it's a good map to kind of just not completely know that we don't have all of the data, because there's some programs that we haven't tabulated into this. This was taken in May of this year, and we have at least 53 school districts that have identified current Grow Your Owns in their school districts. And like I said before, at the end of the presentation, there's going to be some resources for you regarding Grow Your Own. These are all research vetted sources, but I wanted to kind of make sure that we're all clear in how we're defining GYO. And for this purpose, we are defining it that it refers to education models that are designed to invest in the growth and development of and including efforts to diversify the teacher workforce. And for the purposes of this grant, the EAC is committed to support GYOs that include ongoing efforts committed to Oregon's equity initiatives and advocacy for diverse teachers. So to reiterate, this is a grant for teachers only, and pathways for teachers. So it doesn't necessarily have to be for teachers. It can be for students becoming teachers. But for administrators and current teachers, if you're interested, again, you can email me later. So just to kind of highlight again, one of the things that this grant is and what this grant isn't, the backbone of it is that we are working with legislative efforts that are supporting the diversification of Oregon's educator pathways. And before I review the application and evaluation for submitting an application, I also want to recognize that there's going to be many needs and requests that we're not going to be able to fund this year. While we were very elated that the governor protected this funding, given the economic outlook that's been projected, and one that probably hasn't been projected due to the wildfire devastation, we are fully committed to continuing this grant for the future. So I'm going to take a pause, and I'm going to throw the document into the chat, and I want us to kind of go through it just so you kind of know what's part of it, and that way you can kind of start processing some questions. So when you're at the end of this presentation, you'll be able to have more, hopefully, answers to those questions. And I just want to make sure everybody's got that. Does everybody get that in the chat? Angela?
Yeah, it's in the chat. I just clicked on it to make sure that it would open, and it's good.
Okay. So if anybody does have a question, you can, or if you don't have access to it, hold the questions. You could go ahead and jump into, just put something in there and we can change that for you.
I am watching the raised hands on the questions boxes, so anytime you want to drop stuff in there, you can.
Perfect. Thank you. And so just and I forgot to even give you a shout out, Angela. Angela's Bloom is here, support staff, and she was the one who kind of stepped in to take over for me on Monday. So again, shout outs and kudos to you. Okay, so the application, this is all available through ORPN. The first one is just identifying the partnerships. We're kind of curious about who's applying for this. And we've had a couple questions about the problem statement. So I just kind of wanted to pause a little bit here. This is really just to kind of condense in a brief way, a snapshot of what you're trying to do with some of those questions provided. And the word limit is tight there, but it's going to open up in other places. So don't worry too much if you don't have the word space there. There's other places in the application where there's going to be a lot more real estate, if you will, to add more words there. So we're just really kind of looking at giving a snapshot of an overview of your problem. And then you get to the proposed solution. So there you see an immediate bump up to your word limit. And we're looking for a description of the solution that's going to include all of the elements. And these are all linked. And that's with ODE's equity lens and the equity initiatives. An explanation of the applicant's awareness of the community and student strengths and how that's going to be leveraged with a proposed solution. So thinking about it asset-based as opposed to deficit-based understandings. And then a description of how the solution it may not be eliminating the institutional barrier, but maybe it's working towards eliminating institutional barriers for diverse teachers. Number 4.
Lynn,
yeah.
Lynn, can you just 1 second? There's a comment from the audience that they can't see the page that you're showing. What page are you on that document that you linked?
It is on at the very end of the document, so it's 34 and 35. Thank you for that.
Perfect, thank you.
Sorry, I'm jumping ahead. I'll pause a little bit.
There was one other question about the closing date. It said the grant application does not reflect the revision of the due date. Has it been changed to October 26th?
We're going to get there. Let me get through the application. That's coming up. That's next slide. Okay. So for the budget, just making sure that we're all aware, we're assuming that you're going to submit some kind of table. But then there's also space to create a narrative and writing up, because sometimes your tables don't necessarily convey the meaning that you want to do. So we accommodated for that by including some brief explanation of that expenditure table that you're going to provide. And remember that the emerging or developing GYOs, your grant will be, you cannot exceed 200,000 and existing ones cannot exceed 350,000. That doesn't mean that you have to spend that amount of money. So if you think that you just need maybe 100,000 just to get some people in a room and you need that to do the ongoing for the beginning of the emerging one, then you can request a different budgetary amount there. There's a table below all of that, so if you want to look at that, you can. Number 5, this gets into some of the sustainability, and it's not going to hurt your application if you're just doing something that's just for this year. I mean, we kind of recognize that this is a very tight time frame for completing this grant, so it's okay. It's just we wanted to make sure that you're aware of it, what could be next steps, and just kind of making sure that you have that ongoing way of being able to kind of think a little bit more deeply about, well, how could the solution then become long-term? What are some ways that, you can help moving this forward to promote systemic equity-focused changes to diversifying teacher pathways? Number 6, this is where you get that extra word limit, so you can really kind of dive into what you might have felt a little bit confining to the problem statement. And this is, again, to get folks to think about how are you explicitly tying your solution to the state's adoption of the equity initiatives. And so all of these are listed in here, and there's a host of folks at ODE that are working on all of these initiatives, and they are more than willing, if you would like to reach out to them and contact them, to get some information from them. But each of these links kind of gives you a background on what these initiatives are trying to do. And then the last is the evaluation. So we are looking at this to be an ongoing iterative approach to track and evaluate what changes you're trying to implement in your proposed plan, and how your goals are meeting up, and whether or not you meet your goals, but recognizing why didn't you meet your goals, I think that's still valuable. So we would like to have some sort of an evaluation method that you're going to include, so that we can kind of be thinking about this moving forward. As again, I said, we're really committed to making this an ongoing initiative for funding. So just kind of be thinking about how can you kind of keep track of what's working, what's not working, what changes are you making, and then how is that working. So that's the application process. I'm going to have you go to, and this it's the same document, so you're going to scroll up, and on page 9 and 11, we're gonna just kind of go over the evaluation criteria, just so you know what that looks like. So I'll give you a second to get there. So you're gonna have to scroll all the way up through that document.
I want to respond to some of the questions that are popping up. There'll be time at the end to ask the sort of non-logistics questions that I see popping up. So just flagging that so you guys know your questions will be answered.
Thanks, Angela. Okay, so this is our criteria, and we'll have an evaluation committee reviewing it. We do have, it's basically kind of a binary, if you will, does not meet or meets, with points that can kind of be fluctuated in between. The first one is just evaluating your problem statement. To what extent does the application proposed align with Oregon ODE's equity lens and the equity initiatives and the goals to diversify Oregon's teacher pathways? So there's a total of 5 points available for that. We're also including a geographic diversity, and this whole document has all of the terms that we're talking about. So if you're not familiar with this, or you're wondering what does this mean, you can refer to the document for all of these terms. And we put this in here because we really want to kind of encourage growth in some areas that don't often have opportunities for this. So it's either you have it or you don't. But that doesn't necessarily mean that if you don't have it, that could hurt your application. In evaluation 2, we are looking also to the solution, and how are you providing details about that solution. And again, we're looking for that alignment, awareness of your student community, or your just the overall community strengths, and how to leverage these, and thinking about eliminating any of the institutional barriers for diverse educators. In evaluation 3, we're looking at your budget. So you kind of want to make sure that you're looking at it as being fairly flexible and reasonable. Again, given this tight timeline, once we are awarding grants, it won't be until November. So you've got November until June of 2021, and that is a hard deadline. We'll talk about that later, to make this thing happen. In evaluation 4, we're looking at that sustainability piece. And these questions are really kind of guiding questions. I think they help to kind of think about, like, how is each application providing a response to these. So I definitely encourage you to look at the meets criteria as you're putting together your application, and then check it with other folks to just kind of make sure it's clear in what it's saying. I'm just going to cruise through this because I know you guys can get to this later on. Evaluation 5 is around the legislative commitments, which we've talked about. You do only need to include one of these. You could include more, and that's great, but we are looking for at least one of these initiatives, and how is it in alignment with your proposed solution. And then the last one is just looking at your methodology and how you're going to be evaluating your program. Okay. All right. So I want to go back to my slideshow. Oops, I think. I'm almost done. Thanks for being patient. So thinking of the timeline, We are changing the deadline to turn in your applications by October 26th. That's the best that we can do. I know that's not as good as we could make it, but we don't have a lot of time for this grant. So by 5 p.m., those need to be in to Holly Oglesby, and she'll talk a little bit more about that. And then we did not change the deadline for reviewing the grants. So with that in mind, I'm also throwing out an encouragement for anybody who turns them in a little bit earlier. That's fine. It's not going to make, it's not a first come, first serve. It just gives the opportunity for the committee to start reviewing them so that we can get those notifications out on time because we're looking at a very tight timeline. As we look towards December, that's when you can begin launching projects. However, you'll notice that there is a grant time. We purposefully put in July 1st as a retro date for programs that may already have been existing and happening, or maybe some of the developing ones. You would have even also kind of started some of that groundwork. You can, and Holly can walk you through this, but you can basically kind of have some invoicing from that to help kind of with some of that budget. So that's kind of a little bit of a back end to help with some of that work that you may have started already doing. And then here's the deadline, and you have to submit an evaluation report. So one of the big questions that we've had asked is, can we extend the date? And we cannot. That's part of what the legislature has asked of us. So it has to be spent by June 2021. There are no exceptions to this. Even creative ways, there's no exceptions. Everything, the money has to be spent, period. And a couple of other just kind of questions before we get to the questions. I also wanted to, again, review the purpose of the grant, just so we know that what's going on and why we're doing this, and some funding considerations. And then I'm going to also take a moment and throw into the chat the document that we have where we've collated all of your questions and given you some answers so you kind of think about it before we open up the Q&A for this presentation. So baseline criteria needs to support and diversify teacher workforce, be in a partnership, and a plan that includes how to operationalize the state's equity initiatives. The grants are encouraged to promote growth and provide support across the state, including areas defined as geographically diverse. Applications may request and or receive less than the full award for an existing or emerging GYO application. And you already know about the grant funding, but it is inclusive of private entities as well. And then your entity, your organization, your institution, school district can be named in up to 2 applications. And I'm just going to let that settle, percolate for a minute, because that was one of the big questions that we had. And I'm going to put in the chat this document that I think will help answer some of those questions for you all that we've been getting. So give me one second. And just making sure, Angela, did everybody get, is this live? Did the PDF go through?
Yeah, I think we're okay.
Awesome. Okay, so here's where we have some of the questions and some answers. And so I just kind of want to hit a couple of the highlights. We had a lot of questions with regard to submitting multiple applications, and we're trying to kind of address that with this structure. So people who have existing pathways and you have multiple organizations or connections and partnerships with people, we are going to ask that you designate a lead entity. That lead entity will enter into a grant agreement with the state and they will receive the fundings for the grant, but all of the entities must be named in the application. You can also be named in up to 2 applications. And that is going to limit some of you that have multiple partnerships, and we totally understand, but that's going to give us an opportunity to try to meet as many grant applications as possible. So if you are a lead entity for 2 applications, you must prioritize the application that you want to be considered first. So until the money runs out, we'll keep awarding as much as we can. And again, that's that first priority of applications will be evaluated in round 1. We'll go through all of those. And if funds are remaining after that, then we'll go into the second applications. That was probably one of the biggest questions that we had. And so there's many questions that are in there, so you should see those. I'll give you some time to kind of go through them. One question was, do you have to have a university partner? And you absolutely do not. In section B1, there's a grant amount duration. And it gives you some very specific responses. So I want to give you a little bit of time to review these, but I want to again turn your attention to B4, which says the final report is due in June 2021. Does the funding need to be spent by June 2021? It does need to be spent by June 2021. Even if you have an application and you take that and then you put that funding to another organization for them to distribute it for the following year, that can't happen. We also had a lot of questions about the allowable expenses, and I think it's a little bit easier to say what you can't spend your money on. Writing a grant like this in the application, I think we were really trying to keep it open. So you all who are you hold the wisdom in the room, you know what's best for your communities. So think outside the box on this. It's kind of open-ended in some ways to kind of allow for that to happen. Holly says, though, you can't spend it on cars or airplane trips. So just keep that in mind. And if you have specific questions about like what is allowable, what isn't allowable, again, you want to contact Holly for any of the questions. Let's see. The last one is general information. This is kind of close to the end. And we still will be collating this, so we know that there's going to be more questions remaining. Again, to highlight, we are planning on funding this opportunity as much as we possibly can. So while yes, you must complete the funding expenditures by June of 2021, we're hoping that we will have another round of funding going into the next biennium. And there was a question about that narrative word limit per section. Again, I hope I answered that question, but if not, just again, shoot an email to Holly and we can explain that. And the last, well, let me finish this because I'm done and then we're going to open it up. This last one is around eligibility. So if you want to look through this, there's lots of ways that you can be included in this particular grant. So I just kind of want to make sure that everybody sees all of the criteria, all of the themes that we kind of highlighted and put into the Q&A. And that's it. I'm done. I appreciate you all letting me talk for this long. I'm sorry. I hope I didn't overstep too long for talking, but hopefully we answered some of your questions. And Angela, you want to go ahead and start, and we can. Holly, are you there to help answer some of the questions too?
I am, thanks.
Okay. Perfect.
I thought we could start with the questions in the question box and then move to the hands. There's a couple of hands that are up. So the first question in the question box is it a cost reimbursement type of grant? And I'm guessing that question is to Holly.
I'm waiting for Holly.
Hi. Sorry. Yeah, the short answer is yes. And we're still kind of working on this, but what we would like to do is structure a payment mechanism that just kind of allows for kind of 3 chunks. We're trying to reduce the administrative burden on this. And so it would be, your grant would be divided into 3 equal chunks, and we would pay that way. But at the end, we're going to ask for a true up. We're not going to ask for receipts and things like that, but we are going to ask you in your final report to certify that you have in fact spent all of the money that you're claiming.
Okay. The next question is the 5% indirect rate included as part of the max budget, or is it on top of the do not exceed amount?
The indirect or admin costs would be included in the overall grant.
Next question is, do we need letters of support? Can we be named in several Grow Your Own projects? We are a community college and work with several districts and several universities.
Lynn, do you want to take that one?
So I was just looking through the chat myself just to kind of make sure we're getting all the questions. Say it again, Angela, sorry.
Yeah, the question was, do we need letters of support? Can we be named several Grow Your Own projects? We are a community college and work with several districts and several universities.
You don't need letters of support, but again, we're going to go back to how, we are looking at, if you look at that A1 section around the partnerships and how we're looking at those, you're going to need to make some choices in picking those, because otherwise we're going to have overwhelming applications with a variety of people, and we want to make sure we can balance them as best as possible. So you're going to have to prioritize some things.
The next question was, if we have a summer class for aspiring teachers, does it need to be complete by June 30th or just paid for?
Would this be a class that starts in June? Or starts before the end of June?
That question was from Galen McAllister. I'm going to unmute you, Galen, so you can respond. I think that's unmuting.
Oh, here I am. Yeah, we were thinking of a summer program for our instructional assistants. So we could start the class in June, but it wouldn't be completed by June.
I think that might be okay. I think we might need to talk about that a little bit offline and get back to you, but I'll make a note to do that.
Thank you.
Okay, next question was about the date, and I think we answered that. Lynn, if you don't feel like that question was answered appropriately or to what you were asking, maybe just drop another chat in. The next question then is, how are you going to determine what are existing TPPs versus what are emerging or developing? Do we need to have formal MOUs in place to be considered existing? This could really determine the amount we think we are eligible to receive.
I don't think you don't need to have a formal MOU in place. I mean, if you have a program that's been ongoing, you would already be an existing one. I think emerging for us when we were thinking of this would be people have been having conversations about wanting to have a GYO or some kind of pathway for teachers or other educators. And so that's like in the stages of. The existing would be, it's happening. It's like a program that's been going on. Maybe it even started last year, but it is in action, as opposed to it's just beginning to get started, or we're just dreaming of this idea and we'd like to have some funding to support that. Does that help clarify that, Colleen?
So she's currently muted, but I can unmute her. Okay, Colleen, if you want to respond, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Okay, there we go. Yes, that makes sense. I think we, in our case, might have some different pieces going on that would need to be sort of enhanced and expanded. So would that be considered existing?
Is it going on right now? Do you have a program in place?
Yes.
Then yes, that you would be the existing, and you just want to expand and grow it, right?
Yes.
Yes, then you would fit the existing.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
And Lynn, this is Holly. There's another, it might be a kind of a different way to think about it. In the RFA, it actually separates the two groups by existing or new. So something that you're thinking about but actually isn't happening would be new.
So the next two questions are from Tanya. So I went ahead and sent an unmute request to her so she could ask them directly.
Yes. So I was just wondering, I know that ODE in the past has allowed summer spending plans for grants that had such a quick, short time to spend their funds. And I was just wondering why that isn't an option at this time for this grant and possibly a couple of other grants that are just now getting open to spend funds in 7 months.
Tanya, this is Holly. That relates sometimes to the type of funding, and I know ODE has some it's a very limited group of projects or programs that have received approval. Some of it is legislative approval to actually specifically work in the summer, but this particular fund, the money has to be spent by June 30th.
Okay. I was just hoping that, I mean, there's been wiggle room in the past, so I was just hoping that they would be thinking about this quick turnaround. And it's not that you would be doing anything different, it just, and you would be trying to spend your funds before June 30th, but just having that opportunity to really then be purposeful around summer spending through September 1. But all right, thank you.
And I can kind of piggyback on that too. I mean, we have to realize the toll of the pandemic, and there was a lot of concern about funding and where funding was going to get pulled from. So we were kind of waiting to be able to launch this, and we're sorry about that, but we are where we are. And I think that's a good point to kind of again reiterate that you do not need to ask for the full amount of the funding if you don't think you can spend it, because there's a lot of need in this kind of funding. So just kind of remember that we're really pushing for this not to be a one and done. So try to think really carefully about that budget that you're going to be putting together.
Our next question is from Justin, and Justin, you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, we're trying as a EPP who has a lot of new partnerships developing in multiple districts we work with. The prospect of having to tell districts that they can't either include our name or can't apply because we have to prioritize two is I'm just an understanding it's not a separate partnership, new partnership versus existing partnership that we could have two each, is it? Or is it's two overall and that's it?
Two overall, and it could be for two existing or two emerging or an emerging and an existing.
Okay, thank you.
The last listed question is from Aaron. And Aaron, you can unmute if you like, Aaron Cook.
Right. Earlier you were saying that if someone was selected and they were in more than one application, they would have to choose which one they wanted to do. But there's only, 6 universities. So if we were going to try to build a partnership for a Southern Oregon application, and we wanted to work with a university, and that university may want be another partner with a people who are doing it in the north, are they allowed to be a partner as long as they're not the primary?
Well, I mean, again, Holly, jump in here too. We are trying to. Well, first, let me back up. You can partner without having a university partner too. So, community colleges, ESDs, even community-based organizations. So just keep that in mind too. But then the request is high. I mean, I wish I had more money. I mean, we're kind of in a limited situation here, and there's a lot of people who have multiple connections. So we really kind of want to encourage as many applications to apply. And this is the only solution that we could kind of come up with for right now. Obviously, if funding is still available, we're going to keep distributing as we can. But yeah, we do need to limit that to 2 applications, even if you're named in another one. Holly?
I guess what I meant is,
oh, sorry.
Like we're an ESD, and if our program has said, okay, we need to partner with SOU, but SOU already has a part, or we need to partner with Western Oregon because they have a bachelor's program instead of a master's program for secondary, but Western already has an agreement with like WESD. That's just working it out so that they're a partner. We're in a completely different area and we don't interact. Does that mean that we wouldn't get funded, or we would have to do something different because Western couldn't be on both WESDs and ours as a partner, even though they're not the direct recipient?
So it sounds like, this is Holly, those are conversations that, yeah, you would definitely want to have with Western, using this as an example. But say you are the lead in an application and Western is named as your partner, that's fine. And then say Willamette ESD also names Western as a partner, that's fine too. Now, Western has now been named twice, so they can't be part of another application. But if you're the lead on yours and WESD is the lead on the other, you are not, you don't have to prioritize one or two because it's 2 separate leads. So only if Western was the lead on each of those, then Western would need to say, okay, we want this to be our first priority and this to be our second. But if each ESD is the lead, just naming Western as a partner, then both of those could go in round 1. Does that help or make sense?
Yes, it does. But you're saying that if somebody else were to use, like a university couldn't partner on 3, even if that has nothing to do with the others, but.
Correct. They would have to make some choices.
Okay, I want to get to Holly Owens, who's had her hand up for a little while. Holly, you should be able to unmute if you still have a question.
I don't have a question. Thank you.
Okie dokie. There are a couple more questions in the chat. So Crystal, I'm going to unmute you so you can get a clarifying question in. I don't know if we answered this yet or not.
Thank you. So I just wasn't, what I was interpreting from what you guys were saying was that partners can only be listed on 2 applications, but not that there was a limit to the number of partners in a specific application. Is that correct?
There's not a limit to the number of partners on an application. I mean, that could affect if they wanted to be named in another application, it could be, but you could have more than 2 partners.
Okay, thank you.
Kathy Owen, you are unmuted if you'd like to ask your question.
My question is, can ESDs or school districts partner with private universities that are accredited by TSPC? Because there are 14 of us total in the state of Oregon.
Yes, as long as you're from Oregon, or in Oregon, I should say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
The next question is from Esperanza. If you'd like to unmute yourself, you're welcome to.
Thank you. Yes, I'm wondering about what you consider an entity for a partner. So there are programs where we have a consortium, like a gathering of different people, different liaisons from different districts. Can that consortium be considered a partner, or does that have to be distinctly kind of separated out?
Maybe I should have said, because it doesn't say anywhere about private universities.
Holly, do you want to jump in on that, or I can answer that one?
Yeah, sure. So the consortium, if it's an entity, a legal entity of its own standalone way, then that would be fine. But if it's a group of folks who just are getting together and work together, but are not legally bound together as one entity, then each of those components of that consortium would be considered a standalone thing, and therefore that would be one naming of each of those parties.
Okay, so when we talk about legal aspects, are you talking about memorandum of understandings and or are you talking about something else? I'm not quite sure what you mean by legal.
Probably, so like there are groups who actually exist under an intergovernmental agreement, for example. The EAC is one. So that would be a statutory legal entity under ORS 190, and therefore using the EAC as an example, the EAC is one entity.
Okay, thank you.
Last listed question is from Lynn White. Lynn, you're welcome to ask your question. I see Lynn unmuted, but I don't hear anything. But the question was, we are a non-profit online institution and happy to partner. Is there a list of ESDs/others looking for partners?
Well, I mean, I don't know if we have a list that is looking for partners, but let's add that to our way of thinking about this one and how we would provide that. Holly, any thoughts on that, of providing contact for nonprofit?
I think there's a list of education service districts and their contact information online, and I'll certainly try to find it. I feel like it's on the OSBA website, but we can provide that in the next round of questions and answers. ODE and the EAC would not be in the position to facilitate that matchmaking effort, if you will, but you are welcome. We can try to provide ESD contact, and you're welcome to reach out to those ESDs and establish partnerships.
Yeah, that'd be great. So at this point, we're a little 6 minutes under, which is great. That gives you 5 more minutes before your next meeting at 2 o'clock starts, or maybe you're done for the day. But here's a link to all of our information, and this is going to be posted immediately into ORPN, so you can have access to this as well. And then the sources that I was talking about is at the end of this slide with some links about GYOs. We really appreciate you all showing up today and taking some time to think about applying for this grant, and we are looking forward to seeing all of those applications so we can kind of start getting this money out to you all. Thank you so much for being here today, and I wish you a happy rest of your Thursday.
One last quick note, they asked about the resource page again, and so that'll be posted on ORPN. Hopefully you're familiar with that, or the EAC web page.
Both of them will be, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.